It's hard to imagine a more wonderful event than an event like this afternoon where wonderful and generous alumni give professorships to the college so that we can continue our wonderful tradition of teaching. It's fantastic and really special. So let me say a few words in introduction here. Over the years, I should say I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Catherine Epstein. I'm Dean of the Faculty and a professor of history. So over the years, many Amherst faculty members have become legends as a result of their impact on students' lives and on their own fields. Those exemplary teachers inspire not only students, but also other faculty with scholarly and pedagogical excellence and devotion to student success. It is these dedicated and influential scholar teachers that Dwight and Kirsten Poehler celebrate with 2 presidential teaching professorships named in memory of their fathers. It is important to know that Dwight's father, Henry S. Poehler, class of '59, known as Hank, and Kirsten's father, R. John Cooper III, class of '64, affectionately known as Coop, were Amherst graduates, just as Dwight and Kirsten. Their daughter, Greta, is a current student. Dwight's grandfather, Emmons Poehler, was class of '29. Dwight's uncle, Donald McVicker, was class of '51. And Kirsten's uncle, F. Burkhart Runzer, was class of '55. In other words, this is a family with very, very deep roots at Amherst, and it is a family that really understands how dynamic and enduring great teaching is. Now, Hank once described himself as, quote, the classic underachieving sophomore. His Amherst education was interrupted by 2 years of service in the United States Marine Corps. Upon his return to campus, Hank got his first A grade ever. He graduated from Amherst with a degree in English and went on to Harvard Business School. There he completed the Owner-President Management Program and proceeded to become the president and CEO of Lawrence R. McCoy and Company in Worcester, where he worked for 41 years. Hank loved the arts, especially music and singing, and things really got interesting when he co-wrote a musical with Amherst classmate Mel Springer, class of '59. It was staged at the Mass Music and Arts Society Black Box Theater in Mansfield, Massachusetts in 2015, and Hank both produced it and performed in it. It is no wonder, then, for a man with such a lyrical and wide-ranging trajectory as Hank, that this lecture by Geoffrey Sanborn, who is the first Henry S. Poehler 1959 Presidential Teaching Professor, would be titled The Mind in Motion. Jeff will talk about why he cares about teaching and how he came to teach the way that he does. Jeff received his BA from Stanford University and earned an MA and PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles. He has published works on American writers, including Herman Melville and William Wells Brown, and is the recipient of several Best Essay Awards from the Modern Language Association. Jeff has taught in the English department at Amherst since 2012, with class topics ranging from Poe, Faulkner, and the Gothic to literature and the non-human world. Jeff has said that he cares about, quote, reading the kinds of things that, in Thoreau's words, we have to stand on tiptoe to read and devote our most alert and wakeful hours to, about keeping the relationship between intellectual and other than intellectual life as vital as possible, and about making the classroom a place where we can think things that we couldn't have thought under other circumstances, where the special urgencies of literature and film make it possible for us to say freely and forcefully things that we didn't even know that we wanted and needed to say. I've worked very closely with Jeff Sanborn on the curriculum committee in the past 2 years, or I think it's almost 2.5 years, and it's been a total pleasure working with him and seeing his mind at work and thinking so creatively about what we should be doing with our students in terms of curriculum and teaching. Now, let me see. Where are we here? Where have my notes gone? Like Hank Poehler, John Cooper also graduated from Amherst with a degree in English and also went on to Harvard, the law school in his case. He practiced law for more than 30 years, becoming a partner at New York law firm Casey, Lane, and Mittendorf, and ultimately opting for the interesting blend of business and legal issues that comes with being in-house general counsel at companies like Time, Inc. and Young and Rubicon. By all accounts, Coop loved school, and in 1994, 30 years after he left Amherst, he enrolled in an English PhD program at Drew University. He received his doctorate in 2009 and was awarded a prize for his dissertation on James Joyce. In case it's not clear from my remarks, unfortunately, both Hank and Coop have passed away, so they are not here this afternoon. So Coop loved teaching, especially about the intersection of literature and religion. He had a penetrating mind, which I believe will be honored well today by Jyl Gentzler, the first R. John Cooper, 1964 Presidential Teaching Professor. Her lecture, Why Philosophy, takes as its starting point Socrates' famous statement that the unexamined life is not worth living, and looks at why this philosophy is, in fact, crucial to lives worth living. Jyl received her A.B. from Bryn Mawr College and earned an M.A. and Ph.D. from Cornell University. She joined the philosophy department at Amherst in 1989 and publishes work and teaches on ancient philosophy, ethics, and well-being. Jyl is also the director of the college's Writing Center and the faculty director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. In these latter capacities, I work very closely with Jyl, and I've been amazed at how creatively she thinks about her own teaching, as well as teaching more broadly at Amherst. It's in no small part due to Jyl that our faculty are at the forefront of pedagogical innovation. She has worked tirelessly to foster discussion about pedagogy at the college, and our faculty and our students are that much richer for all the work that she does. So I want to thank Dwight and Kirsten, who I believe are on their way for creating a legacy that befits the lives that each of their fathers built. Jeff and Jyl, thank you for your distinguished teaching and your many other contributions to the college. And thanks to all of you for coming. Please enjoy the lectures, and please join me in welcoming Jeff and Jyl.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for coming as well. It's a really great honor to be given this chair, and I sort of used the occasion to think about why, as Catherine mentioned, why I teach the way I teach. A lot of it has felt sort of like I'm doing what I need to do, or I'm doing it the way I feel like doing it. I'm just sort of like finding my way, through this kind of like thicket every day. But there is a logic, and some of my students are in the audience, and there really is a point. There is a reason why we do things the way that we do. But I only know that now because I've been thinking about it for a little while. But now I'm going to tell you. Now I'm going to tell you what I think the reason is. So it's called The Mind in Motion. I taught my first course almost 30 years ago in the fall of 1989 at UCLA, where I was a graduate student in the Department of English. I remember almost nothing about the experience of teaching the course, which was a required first-year composition class, but I do remember vividly the experience of watching the videotape of one of those classes a week after it had been taped. That was then something that all first-time teachers at UCLA had to do. The camcorder had been in the back of the room, and the students had cleared out of its way, so on the TV screen I saw only me in a chair with a wide green blackboard behind me. For 50 minutes, the videotaped version of me sat there, looking around the room sometimes and calling on students, but mainly just talking about God knows what. Occasionally, that version of me would talk himself into a corner, and when he would try to complete whatever point he was trying to make, his hands would begin to fly about, making shapes and punctuating the air with gestures. It was like watching a horror movie. There was the teacher gesticulating wildly, and there was that long expanse of open green space behind him. Use the board! Oh my God, use the board! It's right behind you! I couldn't say that because the teaching instructor was watching the video with me, but I thought it desperately and helplessly over and over for 50 full minutes. Teaching is hard. Learning is hard. When classroom experience defaults to its baseline mode, what it defaults to is a transfer of information that teachers and students alike hold outside themselves, out of contact with what I'm going to call their selves. Let's call that baseline mode instruction. That's all that I was offering or trying to offer in that UCLA classroom. I was too worried about my performance, too panicked about impending shame to offer anything more than that, to get anywhere close to myself as I spoke. It may be that the students in the room didn't expect anything more, but I don't really believe that. At least some of them must have wanted more, must have wanted me to do something more than acceptable, something that drew on resources in me whose size and contents I knew little or nothing about. Was I just a repository of information? Were they just secondary repositories who would be tested eventually to see if they'd managed to hold that information in their minds for a few weeks? If that was the case, the good news was that the class would ask very little of them, which meant that they would have more time to spend on everything else in their lives. But the bad news was really, really bad. It was that their minds and selves had nothing to do with each other. It was that if their selves needed help, their minds couldn't give it to them. I'm going to flash forward 12 years. I'm an assistant professor of literature at Bard College. It's my first day teaching a course in a maximum security prison in upstate New York as part of a startup program that would become known as the Bard Prison Initiative, through which many inmates who successfully applied to the program would earn BAs from Bard. I'm taking attendance using a sheet on which, next to the students' legal names, are the names that they had listed as the ones they preferred to go by. There were 16 students in the class, most of them around my age, most of them black or Latino. I was almost at the end of the list when I called the name Hakeem. A black student who looked a little younger than me, thin, with an intensely focused expression, said, "That's Mr. Kelly to you." So I made a note of it and kept going and then talked through the syllabus with them. When I was done, I asked if anyone had any questions. The thin student raised his hand. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "Is this like a zoo for you? You come and look at the animals?" I said, "No." "How do I know that?" he asked. I said there was no way that he or any of them could know that right then. I knew it wasn't why I was there. I knew I was there because the governor of New York had just ended a program through which inmates had had access to college classes, and because I wasn't willing to accept the idea of prisons as places where you threw people away. But I couldn't prove that, I told them. They were just going to have to find it out for themselves. That exchange and the 13 weeks of classes that followed it were clarifying experiences for me. I hadn't phrased it to myself in exactly that way before, but I had come to believe by that time that the process of education, as opposed to instruction, is the process of finding out more and more about why we are there, why the teacher is there, why the students are there, why anyone is there. Etymologically, education means drawing out or calling forth. It means sensing something more in oneself or another than what at first appears and discovering how to draw it out. Educators, to me, are people who find out over and over again what is bringing them there, face-to-face with students in a classroom. They're people who are continually learning how to ground what they say to others and how they listen to others in the deepest and most resonant parts of themselves that are both rooted in their pasts and called forth by present occasions. That process, the process of grounding the mind in the self, is something that educators model for their students. Over time, their students learn to sense the presence, not only in their teachers, but also in themselves, of something that exceeds, accompanies, and nourishes their mental activities. They learn, hopefully, that their minds are not just functional apparatuses, sources of prestige when they perform well, and sources of shame when they do not. They learn that their minds and selves are continuous with one another, that the belief in their separateness comes at an enormous personal and social cost. I'd by this point developed some persistent classroom habits. One was to periodically get up and walk to a different part of the room. That I still don't understand. Another was to use the blackboard not as a place from which useful information could be copied, but as a place to scrawl or draw in response to some imperfectly formulated thought or image that had suddenly begun to occupy my mind. I'd also begun to develop some consistent pedagogical strategies, the most important of which was to require each student to write before class at least 3 paragraphs in response to some element of that day's reading. The common theme of all these aspects of my teaching was movement. I'd realized that what animated and interested me most about the classroom experience was that it kept my mind, and ideally my students' minds, in motion, moving from thought to thought to thought. I asked for long pre-class responses to the readings uploaded to an online discussion forum because I wanted to see and wanted them to experience their minds in motion, turning a passage over and over, associating it to another passage, leaping quickly to a new thought. I asked them in class to say more about their pre-class writing because I wanted them to experience their minds in motion in the act of speaking, and because I wanted to stimulate other students' minds into motion too. When it was going well, my students and I could contribute to and draw on a mind in motion that we increasingly held in common, a reservoir of thinking that no one of us could have independently supplied. And not just thinking. Because the mind and motion that we held in common opened up into each of ourselves, it was capable of making contact with parts of those selves that never would have been touched by instruction. At times, when it felt right, I would speak briefly about a part of myself that the workings of our minds had touched. At times, some of the students in the class would do the same thing. Most of the time, there were moments at which there was, in the room, a feeling of contact, not just between one another, but between our mental activities and our lives. The value of those moments was, in part, that they tended to vitalize our discussions. But they were even more valuable, I think, as evocations of the way in which the mind at work, the mind in motion, can unexpectedly touch and stir the parts of ourselves that we tend to think of as being at the greatest possible distance from it. Now, because I'm a literature professor, I'm going to drop my voice and take up someone else's. It's the voice of the speaker of William Butler Yeats's Long-Legged Fly. This is the poem. That civilization may not sink, its great battle lost. Quiet the dog, tether the pony to a distant post. Our master Caesar is in the tent where the maps are spread, his eyes fixed upon nothing, a hand under his head. Like a long-legged fly upon the stream, his mind moves upon silence. That the topless towers be burnt and men recall that face, move most gently if move you must in this lonely place. She thinks part woman, 3 parts a child that nobody looks. Her feet practice a tinker's shuffle picked up on a street. Like a long-legged fly upon the stream, her mind moves upon silence. That girls at puberty may find the first atom in their thoughts, shut the door of the Pope's chapel, keep those children out. There on that scaffolding reclines Michelangelo. With no more sound than the mice make, his hand moves to and fro. Like a long-legged fly upon the stream, his mind moves upon silence. And that's the end of the poem. Pure concentration, the critic Charles Altieri writes, leads each of the 3 figures in Yeats's poem, Julius Caesar, Helen of Troy, and Michelangelo, beyond the cognitive functions of consciousness to some fundamental reality knowable only to the degree that one can feel its constitutive force. The refrain, Altieri goes on to say, is the poem's means of acknowledging that force and of seeking identification with it. For it not only points to the silence, but also offers a mode of circling back on one's own states so that one might be able to glimpse what evades all our practical orientations. And this circling with increasing intensity is the best response lyric can offer to the history that always threatens to reduce it to irrelevance. The force to which Altieri refers is one that operates indifferently in the water steppings of long-legged flies, in Caesar's preparations for battle, in Helen's picked-up dance, and in Michelangelo's to-and-fro brushstrokes. Although the stature of Caesar, Helen, and Michelangelo can make them seem unapproachable, they are what they are only by virtue of their ability to give themselves over to a creative process in which anyone can participate. By intensifying the movement of one's mind, one can circle back on something in oneself that evades one's practical orientations. Once one has felt the force of that relationship between the mind and what the psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott calls the non-communicating central self, once one has sensed what that force might make it possible for one to do, one knows that there are, in oneself, places worth getting to, and that the mind, which so often seems to entirely cast its lot with the outside world, is capable of opening channels to those places. The mind's relationship to those parts of the self can be interpretive, but it doesn't have to be. It is enough, more than enough, for it to be stimulative. At such moments, into a space opened up by the rhythm of the mind's successive thoughts, something vital flows. Here's a non-classroom example. Let me get a drink of water. Two days ago, I was driving from Northampton to Amherst for advising meetings. I was in traffic. It was gray and early, and I was thinking about the students I was about to meet. One of them had a not very common last name. It was the last name of a student I'd once had, the last name of 3 students, actually, siblings. Harry, the youngest, Catherine, the oldest, and the middle sibling. the one I'd known best, my thesis advisee, whose name I could not at that moment remember. I was startled that her name was not coming to mind. She'd written the first half of a senior thesis on Nabokov and Cervantes with me in spring 2009. And that summer, she'd gone swimming off the coast of South Carolina and had gotten caught in a riptide, and while her friends swam to shore for help, had been drawn underwater and swept away. Her body had never been found. How could I not remember her name? I'd spoken at her memorial service. I'd gotten to know her parents. It had been one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. The traffic was crawling. I looked to my left. There was a sign that read, "Touchless Car Wash." And then into my mind came her name, Anna. I was filled with grief and also with a kind of happiness that you feel when someone you care about, someone you haven't seen in a long time, appears at your door. And because I knew that she'd only come back because my mind had gone into a special rhythmic form of attentiveness, into a concentrated state of expectation, I was grateful not for my mind exactly, but for the mind. I was grateful that it could be a conduit to parts of myself, that it could serve as a holding environment for those parts of the self, that even the most painful and obscure things could sometimes find a place in it, and that those things could, temporarily, suffuse it with their distinctive atmosphere. When a classroom discussion stirs up something of this kind, I only sometimes make reference to it, and I never linger on it for long. If it's not spontaneous, relevant, and compressed, if it's just an anecdote, then it's narcissistic, trivializing, and I don't want anything to do with it. What I want, above all else, is for a certain kind of feeling to build up in the classroom over time, a feeling about the nature of the discussions that we're having in that room. I want all of us to feel that the things that we're talking about can at any moment, for any one of us, call up something unexpected, and that the classroom, a space in which all of our minds are in motion, is a space into which those unexpected things can be spoken. It's striking how often the students in these classes begin speaking on their own from those kinds of internal places. Again, not in narcissistically confessional modes for the most part, but in musing, half unwilling, halting, non-interpretive ways. The classroom very often becomes a space in which the collective movement of our minds is punctuated by the emergence of parts of ourselves, so much so that it begins to feel as though there's a rhythmic, quasi-musical dimension to what we are doing, as though the discussions build and build and build again toward a point at which the non-semantic stakes of our semantic procedures, our pursuits of knowledge and meaning, are exposed. Later that day, 2 days ago, I was teaching the end of Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior. Some of the students had found the ending of the last chapter, which is called A Song for a Barbarian Reed Pipe, to be somewhat anticlimactic. I think I'd felt that way about it too in my previous experiences of teaching the book, but this time through, I'd more fully imagined myself into the fictional scene, and I'd had a very different experience of it. The narrator is telling the story of Sai Yen, a Han poet born in AD 175, who'd been carried off at the age of 20 in a raid by a tribe from the south. She had been with the tribe, referred to by the narrator as barbarians, for 12 years and had borne 2 children. One night, the narrator writes, she heard music tremble and rise like desert wind. She walked out of her tent and saw hundreds of the barbarians sitting on the sand. They were blowing on flutes. They reached again and again for a high note, yearning toward a high note, which they found at last and held, an icicle in the desert. The music disturbed Sai Yen. Its sharpness and its cold made her ache. She hid in her tent but could not sleep through the sound. Then, out of Sai Yen's tent, which was apart from the others, the barbarians heard a woman's voice singing, as if to her babies, a song so high and clear it matched the flutes. Her words seemed to be Chinese, but the barbarians understood their sadness and anger. Sai Yen was eventually ransomed and brought the song, called A Song for a Barbarian Reed Pipe, back to China. It translated well, Kingston's narrator tells us in the last sentence of the book. What I had missed in my earlier readings was that the name of the song and the title of the chapter are the same. I'd missed the implicit evocation in this passage of what the chapter moves toward, what the book as a whole moves toward. Like the song that Sai Yen hears, Kingston's writing reaches again and again for a high note on one instrument, one voice after another. The yearning in the book is not, in the end, a yearning to be known, to be cognitively understood. Earlier in the chapter, the narrator tells us that when she was young, she had had a list inside her of the things that she wanted to tell her mother so that she would know the true things about her, and that she had believed that if her mother knew the list, she and the world would become more like her, and she would never be alone again. What the narrator discovers, however, is that once she finally begins telling her mother those true things, the list only grows. There will never be, she realizes, a higher listener, someone whose knowledge of her equals or surpasses her knowledge of herself. I once believed, and I say this with embarrassment, that Kingston's point was that no one can ever truly share himself or herself with anyone else, that no one can ever truly bring himself or herself far enough forward to be recognized. I realized this time through how profoundly different the narrator's younger self and older self are. I realized that the narrator is, like the flute players, like Cyan, yearning toward a high note, toward a tonality that signifies the limit of the instrument, as opposed to the tonic note or resting place in a melody. What that tonality signifies is not what is in her, the essence of who she is, but how much is in her. So much, Kingston implies, that it exceeds the capacity of the instrument and can only be expressed by seeking, finding, and then holding the note at the instrument's limit, holding it, ideally, in concert with others, inspiring others to translate it to their instruments. What are we doing here? What is most truly bringing us here to a space that's primarily dedicated to the development of the mind? Not, I think, the mind itself. Other aspects of the self, for the mind is in the end just one of the aspects of the self, take us to this river, dip us in this water. We cannot know in advance what those things are. We will never fully know what they are. We can, however, enable ourselves, through the self-attuned motion of the mind, to feel their force, to give that force expression, and to discover in the mind's motion a place in which that expression can be held. And we can, in the very special space of the discussion-based classroom, name the things that we hold so close to our hearts that we hardly ever name them. The names of those things are different for each of us, but they can, under the right circumstances, translate well. Thank you.
Technical difficulty here. Okay, I think I'm good. Yeah, okay. In 2015, during the Republican presidential debates, what seems like a lifetime ago, then candidate Marco Rubio famously said, "We need more welders and less philosophers." Rubio may have been right that we need more welders. I don't know. But he was wrong to think that we have to make a choice, that for every additional welder in the world, we have to sacrifice one philosopher, or two, or three. I believe instead that if we need more welders, we need welders who are also philosophers, just as we need doctors who are philosophers, and philosopher lawyers, and philosopher teachers, and philosopher moms and dads. In fact, I think everybody should be a philosopher. In taking this stand, I'm disagreeing with Plato, a philosopher whose work has consumed most of my adult life. He argued in a famous dialogue, The Republic, that philosophers should be the rulers of a society because they would have the knowledge and insight to tell the rest of us how we ought to live our lives so that we can be as happy as possible. The rest of us should just stick to our jobs, building houses, growing food, and making shoes. But it's this same book, The Republic, that has convinced me that Plato was wrong in limiting philosophy to the rulers. In my view, all of us, or at least as many as possible, must do philosophy and do it well. All of our lives depend on it. Now, I realize that this is a pretty outrageous thing to say, so let me try to defend my position. The first point I want to make is that no one can avoid philosophy. This can be seen from the very beginning of Plato's Republic, where Plato represents his teacher Socrates talking to an elderly and very wealthy man named Cephalus. Cephalus tells Socrates that his friends are afraid of death because they know that they haven't always lived their lives on the straight and narrow. They've done things that they aren't proud of, and now they worry that when they die, they're going to be punished by the gods. In contrast, Cephalus has had the good fortune, he says, to have enough money that it's been fairly easy to avoid doing anything unjust. He's never had to cheat or deceive another person. If he owed someone something, he could afford to give it to them. And so he's confident that when he dies, the gods will be good to him. He has nothing to worry about. In this short exchange, Cephalus has implicitly taken a stand on a variety of philosophical questions. Whoops. There we go. He assumes that there are better and worse ways to live his life, and that he has chosen the right way. He assumes that he will survive the death of his body. He also assumes that his future is under the control of gods who punish unjust people when they reach the underworld. He assumes that he will avoid punishment, or at least, yes, because he assumes that he has never done anything wrong, or at least not so wrong, that the gods will hold it against him. He has figured out how to live. The beliefs that I've identified as some of Cephalus's philosophical beliefs count as philosophical for three reasons. One, they are some of his most fundamental assumptions, so fundamental that he takes their truth for granted. Two, these beliefs are held independently of any direct empirical evidence. Nothing that he has seen, heard, or felt can prove that Cephalus has led his life in the right way, or that he will survive the destruction of his body, or that there are gods who care about what he does and will punish him or reward him, depending on what he does. And yet, these beliefs are not, for that reason, dismissed as irrational, like beliefs in unicorns or leprechauns. We have to have some beliefs about what's important and what are the likely consequences of our choices, about who is ultimately responsible for the good and harm that people and other creatures suffer in the world, and about what other people or creatures deserve to happen to them, about what is real and what is not, and about how we know what is real and important and what is not. We have to have these beliefs because whether it is ultimately our blessing or our curse, we are humans. And humans don't just act, they choose to act in the way that they do. And it would be impossible for us to make any choices about how to live our lives if we had no sense of what was worthwhile and what was not. And this observation led me to the third feature of his beliefs. Oops. Yes, that's working. That makes the beliefs of Cephalus that I have identified as philosophical. Cephalus's philosophical assumptions are those by which he makes sense of the world and his place in it. The life that he has lived, the choices that he has made, just wouldn't make sense unless those beliefs were true. However, as Plato pointed out, it's one thing to have philosophical views, and it's quite another to be a philosopher. And so this is my second point. Philosophers differ from non-philosophers, not in having philosophical beliefs, but they differ insofar as they take the time to determine whether the assumptions that they use to make sense of their lives are true, and whether they really know that they are true. When I say that everybody should be a philosopher, I'm saying that everybody should do just that. They should, at least periodically, stop what they are doing and take the time to ask themselves whether the assumptions on which they are acting, the assumptions that they've inherited from their parents and grandparents, from the other members of their village or nation state, or the multinational corporations who are trying to make a profit off of their beliefs and desires, are true. If your beliefs about these things are not, in fact, true, and if the desires that motivate you are not, in fact, for anything worthwhile, then the choices that you make, indeed your very life, really won't make any sense. Now I'd like to introduce you to another character in Plato's Republic, whose name is Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus has taken the time to ask himself whether the assumptions on which he and everyone else have been basing their lives are true. And his answer is that most people are completely wrong. He points out that at least in 5th century Mediterranean, 5th century BCE, that is, the so-called rules of justice, the rules that most people try to follow, are simply the invention of greedy rulers rather than endorsed and enforced by the gods. They are designed to serve the interests of the rulers rather than of the people they rule. And reflecting on this insight, Thrasymachus drew another radical conclusion, that only simpletons and weaklings are just. People who are just either don't understand the true nature of justice, Thrasymachus thinks, or they understand it, but they are too weak or scared to do anything other than follow the rules. On Thrasymachus's view, if we could somehow avoid punishment, either through deception or brute force, we would be fools to continue to play by the rules of justice. It is for this reason that he concludes that injustice, rather than justice, is a virtue. While Thrasymachus has been roundly condemned by the majority of Plato's scholars, I think we have to concede that Thrasymachus had a point. Cephalus and Thrasymachus were, like Socrates, real historical figures in the 5th century BCE. Cephalus acquired his great wealth by owning a factory that made weapons that Athens used in its lengthy war with Sparta. Cephalus's factory ran on the labor of 150 slaves, people who were forced to be slaves because they were on the losing side of a battle, the battles that were started by empires like Athens, who constantly sought more and more power and more wealth, using the tools that Cephalus's factory manufactured. Was Cephalus unjust? He didn't think so. He abided by the laws, paid his taxes, and told the truth. But Thrasymachus had a different perspective. Thrasymachus was a native of an Athenian colony known as Chalcedon that was badly treated by both Sparta and Athens during the Peloponnesian War, all in the name of justice. The historian Thucydides represents the powerful Athenians' attitudes toward those who are less powerful in a speech that he attributes to Athenian ambassadors who were responding to a revolt attempted by the Spartan colony Melos against Athenian rule. The Melians attempted to resolve the conflict by appealing to considerations of justice, to which the Athenian delegates respond in the following way. For our part, they say, we will not make a long speech no one would believe, full of fine moral arguments. And they go on, but saying that our empire is justified because we defeated the Persians in an earlier war and you're now benefiting from that, or that we are coming against you for an injustice that you have done to us. We could make those arguments. However, we both know that decisions about justice are made in human discussions only when both sides are equal. When one side is stronger, it gets as much as it can. And the weak must accept that. So this is Thucydides, the historian, talking about the ways that Athenians, the powerful Athenians, treated their weaker counterparts over whom they had power. And having pointed all of this out, the Athenians killed all of the island's adult males and made slaves of all of the women and children. Yes, go back to that. If we look at our own world today, it's hard not to see parallels. People use the language of justice to justify all sorts of violence and predation or indifference to the suffering and humiliation of others. And when they're powerful enough to get away with it, as the Athenian delegates pointed out, they feel free to avoid the language of justice altogether. Instead, the language of justice is replaced by the language of winners and losers, and no one wants to be a loser, and so everyone is desperately seeking to be a winner, no matter what it takes. So, is there any avoiding either desperation or cynicism, as Thrasymachus did? Now, this is an image of Plato's famous image of the cave, which represents, as he puts it, various stages in our education. Every time I turn here, you can't hear me, so. Unlike Cephalus, and I think that Cephalus is represented as these people at the bottom of the cave. Thrasymachus, so they're kind of deluded by these shadows here that are being presented by these people who are manufacturing these images for them to see. And those that are least educated are represented as only seeing the shadows. And I think that Thrasymachus' role in this particular image, as far as our progression in education, is to have turned around and noticed that the images of justice that are projected in their society are manufactured by other people. That's as far as he got. And so he concluded, having seen that most people were deluded by those who held power into acting in ways that didn't serve their own interest, but served instead the interests of the powerful. But that's, as I said, as far as he got. He concluded that people are the way they are, and they're motivated in the way that they are, and so the only choices for him were either to be a victim of manipulation and predation, or to be a manipulator or predator. And between those choices, Thrasymachus chose to be a predator. Are there any other options? Well, here's where the character Socrates, the genuine philosopher, comes to the rescue. And why do I call him a genuine philosopher? Because philosophers not only take the time to question and challenge their most fundamental assumptions, but in addition, they have the tools to think clearly toward better views. Socrates observes that as humans, not only do we act, but unlike most other animals, we have the ability to reflect on our desires and decide which ones we should endorse and which we should reject. So let's follow his lead and reflect on our own desires. Socrates claims that all of our desires fit into one of two categories: necessary and unnecessary desires. Necessary desires are desires that we have by nature and whose satisfaction benefits us. In contrast, unnecessary desires, desires that we may have acquired under certain circumstances, are ones that we could get rid of. But another feature of necessary desires, as Socrates defines them, is that they lead to no good, or even to the opposite. So think about it for a minute for yourself, about the desires that you have. Which of your desires are necessary, and which are unnecessary, according to these definitions? Now, I did this experiment in my class this week using Post-it notes. We had pink Post-it notes, and we had purple Post-it notes. And here's where my class, where they stood with looking at their desires. Necessary desires were for nutritious food, water, shelter, clothing, sleep, health, knowledge, affection, community, sex, and because it was a philosophy class, philosophy was there. And they listed fast food, wine, recreational drugs, killing. There's some dispute about these. Killing, power, fame, material goods, other than needed for this, expensive things, wealth, sex appears on both lists, and TV. Although he's less explicit about this point, Socrates also draws a distinction between what I call competitive desires versus non-competitive desires. Competitive desires are ones that Thrasymachus himself emphasizes. They're desires to outdo other people. Non-competitive desires are desires the satisfaction of which does not take anything away from anyone else. And here are the examples that my class came up with. Status, because the more status you have, the less other people have, so it's competitive. Private property, what you have, other people don't have. High grades, if you're, as they pointed out, if your professor is grading on a curve, it becomes a competitive desire. Exclusive goods. Hunting, they mentioned, I guess it's because in competition with the hunted. Spoils of war, gambling, winning, being number one, being better than others. And in contrast, non-competitive desires are ones that desires the satisfaction which does not take anything away from anyone else. Knowledge, friendship, health, being in nature, inner peace, dancing, children, art, and music. All right, so what does this show? I'm suggesting that these two distinctions that Socrates offers us helps us to see a way beyond the situation that Thrasymachus is describing. It's pretty obvious what's wrong with unnecessary desires. They are, by definition, desires the satisfaction of which leads to no good or perhaps even harm. But what about competitive desires? In our very competitive society, we are told that these desires are necessary if people are to be motivated to be their very best. But it turned out that when I asked my students to reflect on desires that they designated as either competitive or non-competitive, and to categorize these desires according to the first distinction between necessary and non-necessary desires, it turned out that without any coaching from me, that no one put a single competitive desire into the category of necessary desires. And maybe they just were thinking, oh, this is what Gentzler wants to turn out. But the purple ones are all non-competitive desires that they listed, and so they put them on the board, and that's how it ended up. Now, why was that? Why could that be? Well, as Socrates puts it, the person who really wants to be excellent at their craft, whatever that is, being a musician, being a physician, or being a philosopher, the person who wants to be excellent at their craft doesn't want to outdo other musicians, physicians, or philosophers. They want the others to be excellent as well. If the others are also just as excellent, each of them can achieve even more. To be a great musician, physician, or philosopher, you need to be surrounded by and work with other great musicians, physicians, and philosophers. If your goal is to outdo the others, then not only will you not be motivated to help others to do well, but your own achievements, without the helps of other excellent people, will be so much less impressive. Now this picture, you might think, what? Is this what philosophers look like? apparently so. This is how they dress at the University of Chicago. I got that off of their philosophy website. I don't know what they do with those rakes for philosophy. But there are other problems, I think, with competitive desires. The pursuit of the objects of those desires is never ending in a competitive world because there is always another competitor eager to be or do better than you. And for that reason, the pursuit of the objects of these desires can distract you because they're constantly ones that you have to be working on from satisfying your necessary desires, ones that you acknowledge to be important and valuable. The more competitive the desire, the greater the likelihood that you will not satisfy the desire, depending on how high you want to be in the competition. And for this reason, the pursuit of the objects of these desires can create anxiety, and if frustrated, depression. The competitive pursuit of material goods will lead to conflict and war. And I don't know if you can see this, but our collective competitive pursuit of material goods is destroying our planet. Thrasymachus' initial insight was that the unjust person, this is how he characterizes them, is the person who seeks to outdo other people by getting the most that he can from everyone else. Socrates' insight is that the desires to outdo, competitive desires, destroy the possibility of happiness, both for those who have them and for everyone affected by them. To be genuinely happy, we should restrict our desires to necessary, non-competitive desires. Once we do that, we climb out of the cave and we live harmoniously up in the sunshine watching birds in a non-competitive way. Now, how do you bring about this result that Socrates has described? Well, Plato thought that philosophical insight of this sort was really beyond most people. And that's why he thought that we needed philosophers to rule the state and, as it were, purge everyone else of their unnecessary desires. Now, this proposal usually doesn't go over very well with my students. And the reason for this, I think, is that Plato underestimated the force of two other necessary desires that most humans feel quite strongly. One is a desire to understand, and two is a desire to do what you yourself decide is best. And if I'm right that these two desires are genuinely necessary for human beings, then no one is ever going to be happy having their lives controlled by the philosophical elite. In order to be genuinely satisfied with their lives, human beings have to come to the recognition themselves of what is genuinely important and what is not, and they need to act on that insight. And unless all, or at least most of us, come to the conclusion that we are better off restricting our desires to our necessary desires, the competitive unnecessary desires of some people will create artificial conditions of scarcity, which will prevent the rest of us from satisfying even our necessary, non-competitive desires. And this is why we all need to be philosophers.
Yeah.
Mr.
Kelly.
I'm not sure if I recall, did you tell us what the end of that story was with him? Did he feel at the end like he had experienced what you wanted him to experience, that sense of motion?
I mean, I didn't ask him, but the class as a whole, it was a remarkable, bunch of students. It was one of the best classes I've ever taught, and I taught in the prison one other semester. A few years later, it wasn't quite the same kind of like, just really, really high level of kind of like, excitement and intellectual work, and so no, it was that what I was feeling in that moment was more like he needed to know that I wasn't just coming there for shallow reasons. He needed to know that there was something that didn't necessarily even have to be named. You got to be here for some deep reason. And if I don't know that, I can't trust you, and I'm not going to be involved in any of this. I mean, so he was a good student. He was a participant in the class the whole way through. And I think when I'm saying it was like transformative for me, or at least clarifying, it was a moment when I realized how kind of like vital it was, like in every educational context, to know really, or to gradually find out what is really bringing you there. That the mind doesn't bring you to the place where the mind develops. The mind alone does not bring you to the place where the mind develops. Something else is bringing you there. And it's something that I would have no way of naming. I mean, I couldn't just sort of like come up with some kind of like elaborate kind of like account of myself at that point. He was just going to have to sense it in me, like in my actions, not what I said, but what I did. And so, I also have no way of knowing whether he was satisfied by, by the way I taught the course. But I did feel pretty profoundly that everything that I did in that course, and I felt it more and more in the courses afterwards too, was predicated on my ability to convey that I was really there for a reason. I told a student once a few years ago that I was into like high stakes literary criticism, and she's like, I don't know what that means. Like, how could that be? How could that be the case? And I feel like I can't understand how you could practice and continue to practice for a long time a sort of like low stakes literary criticism or academic work of any kind. It feels like it desiccates. It kind of like loses its kind of like point. If you're not really figuring out and finding out like really what brings you there, why are you coming there? Day after day after day. It can't be just for a grade. Can't be just for a salary. This is a very special place in our culture. People don't get together to sort of think together, work together, and find out how their minds change when they're in concert with other minds. This is every classroom experience feels so valuable, and these days more and more. It's just like the space in which these kinds of encounters can occur is just shrinking rapidly. It feels like there needs to be like a reoccupation of that space, an articulation of why it's valuable, and a broadcasting to a media that's only interested in bad and stupid stories about colleges. Look, here's what actually goes on, like every day. And here's why it matters. Somebody needs to do that.
This is a question for Jyl. I really liked your talk. I was wondering what Socrates would say about Alex's overwhelming desire to play chess. I think he gets more happiness out of losing to 8-year-olds at chess tournaments than out of doing philosophy, at least. But it's a competitive desire, but it certainly seems like it's part of the good life for him. And it's certainly not a necessary desire. It's not one he has by nature.
Right. So the distinction between necessary and unnecessary desires appears on the surface to not be exhaustive, right? Because the way in which Socrates describes it is that the necessary desires are ones that we have by nature and whose satisfaction benefits us. And then he says about unnecessary desires that they either bring no good or that they hurt us. And it seems as if there could be a class of desires that would benefit us, but we don't have by nature, like a desire for it to play chess. I'll get to the competitive aspect in a second. what I think is going on there is that the necessary desire that we have, that the desire to play chess satisfies, is a desire for pleasure. And then certain things can give us pleasure, which and in ways that don't lead to kind of long-term costs. I think that actually, my own view is that, and actually I think Socrates acknowledges at a certain point in later in the Republic, is that there are certain competitive desires that do not necessarily lead to any kind of harm, and that it may well be that human beings do enjoy winning or beating other people. And I guess and he thought that actually people who would be warriors and the policemen in the society have a lot of competitive desires. So that's what kind of motivates them to go out there and face that danger, is that they want to win. And so I think really he thinks that not that no one should have competitive desires, but that we need to channel them in productive ways. And so when unless he's humiliating the 8-year-old, the other way around. So that's perfectly innocent in that he's winning, but actually, and it's losing, but it's almost like it's a playing of winning and losing, because no one really is harmed in that circumstance. But with other sorts of competitive desires, my gain is your loss in a more significant sense, not symbolic.
I think what I have to ask is very small, and it could be that you've already addressed it, but I mean, just if you think about Plato's Republic and even the things that you spoke about today, right, there's a moment where Socrates does give like the idea of a pretty cooperative, happy society, and Glaucon says, yeah, but who would want to live in that? It's just for pigs.
Right.
And you would imagine, given the kind of view that you've given us today, that Socrates would say to Glaucon, no, that's wrong. It's not just for pigs. But in fact, he says, yeah, you're kind of right. And then spends a long time trying to tell a new kind of story that seems to take into account more than just our need for sort of cooperation.
So he doesn't say, yeah, you're kind of right. What he says is, you're right, maybe some people will never be satisfied with limiting our desires to, and remember what the desires are that are satisfied in that first state. They are only bodily desires. They are desires for food, shelter, clothing, and maybe some olives, if to get a little bit of pleasure. And you'll notice that in the ideals, so by the time we get to the final ideal state of Plato's, unnecessary desires are purged from the whole state. But the difference between his new state and the old state is that he's recognized that the human psyche is much more complicated than a non-human psyche. And so we have a desire for honor that he's associated with the spirited part, and then we have rational desires. And those are the two desires that I mentioned as the necessary desires, which actually I think counter his suggestion that anybody's going to be happy being told by philosophers what to do, because all of us have these two rational desires to know for ourselves how the world is, and then to act on our own conception of the good. And that's, you don't have that in the earlier state.
Thank you for both your wonderful thoughts. I'm wondering, with respect to desire and the notion of a natural desire, I'm wondering if we add something like the Anthropocene to that notion, right? Which is to say, who knows what our natural desires are anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually kind of an important problem. And I think it may be important, at the level of education, because part of it is, what is the hunger? What is the hunger for a wonderful education, say, at Amherst College. I mean, arguably, if we put your talks together, I mean, maybe Amherst is an unnecessary desire, right? I mean, maybe we should have just public education in these times.
But if you'd had that, and I think this is what you're saying about the space for the kinds of conversations that we're having now, then you're not going to have much philosophy left, because philosophy departments at public universities are being restricted because of the controls of wanting to have only those sorts of courses that are going to lead to people having profitable occupations. And so there is a real pressure in public universities against having the humanities, where we would examine these questions about what really does matter, what's important. And so I think it's that education like at Amherst is satisfying a necessary desire because of those two rational desires that I mentioned. Every human being really wants to know, not just be fed a lot of information and be trained to do something or other, but really understand that the world in which they're operating, and make choices for themselves in light of what their own desires that they don't merely have, but that they've reflected on. Where did they come from? Who is profiting from my having this particular desire? Am I profiting from having this particular desire? And having the space and the time and having the conversations in our classrooms about those sorts of things, I think it is a luxury, to be sure, but I think it's necessary in order for any of us to be living the lives that we could be.
You've actually answered it so beautifully. So can we put wine back up on the necessary?
I agree with you, yes.
That wine is there.
I actually wonder whether Jeff has a response to that question.
Not directly. I mean, I have. I do think it's hard to tell the difference between natural and non-natural desires, and so that becomes, and it's interesting to think about in terms of the Anthropocene as well, like what necessary desires are right now in terms of like survival, let's say, are maybe different. That seemed to be part of your implication too, right? Or maybe different than what they were in classical Athens.
I have a question for Professor Sanborn. So the title of your talk is called Mind and Motion.
Yes.
And from that, I can sort of sense that not only is there a creative element in motion, but also there's a laborious element in motion. And
Say that again, a labor or what?
Labor. So in the process of concentration and in getting our mind from here to there, there's also this process of labor. And so what laborious process do you think is necessary in the education here at Amherst? And how do you view that element against the creative element?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And my answer is that it's not necessarily labor that sets the mind in motion. Like I have kids and they're not set in motion only by kind of like, labor. It's like when they do what they want to do, for one thing, and then also if you want to get them to do something, it's very often like a good idea to appeal to some kind of element of play in it. That there's and I do feel like it's hard to factor out the pleasure principle in terms of like people's motivation. And so part of like in sense of like getting people's minds in motion, it's almost there can be a kind of like responsive exuberance, like you're like I do a talent show at the elementary school too, and I'm like, hey, it's fun to perform, come up and sing, here, use the microphone, and like just clap, and like you get everybody excited about it. And they begin doing things that they hadn't done before. They learn what it's like to perform. They can develop a taste for it and things like that. So I think that I do believe in the power of like play. I just gave this. I'm teaching a class called The Value of Literature, and earlier today I gave a couple of sample presentations, and one was called Melville's Exuberant Play, and it was about how human beings and animals play, not reptiles and insects. I hear from biologists, but and that the animals who play when they're cubs, like wolves, end up in more tightly cohesive social units than animals that don't play, like foxes and coyotes. This is true with two different kinds of seals too. And so it's a powerful means of putting the mind in motion, just kind of inviting the mind to play. And I think that's mainly what I do.
Yes, Professor Gentzler, you seem to come down pretty strongly, if I'm interpreting correctly, against Cephalus's concept of justice and a just society. So I wonder, though, and I think this is a particularly interesting question in these times, is there no possibility of justice in society? Is it always injustice that's at the heart of justice because the people in power create the concept of justice?
So that's where Thrasymachus ended up. But what I was suggesting was that if you take Socrates' view and we all examine our desires really carefully and figure out which are for things that are genuinely worthwhile and which are not, then the motivation for what we would ordinarily think of as injustice, not Thrasymachus' cynical notion, because everybody knows that what the Athenians did was not just, or that tyrants are not just, even if they're the ruler setting, but that if everybody reflects on their own desires and figures out what's really important and what's really worthwhile, family, friendship, housing, community, those various things, and they purge themselves of those desires that they can't endorse, on their own. Not that someone else purges from them, but they themselves, upon reflection, can't endorse. Then Socrates' thought is that we will have justice, genuine justice in that situation. But in the absence of that, it's going to be impossible, because people are always going to be motivated to pursue more and more, and that's going to create conditions of scarcity for us, so that we have to do things that we would prefer not to do, just in order to meet our most basic desires. And so that's where the coming out of the cave is, and it will only happen, as I say, if all of us become philosophers and actually do that work, because in the process of doing that, we lose the motivation that we would have to be unjust to other people.
And you think it's possible? If
we are all philosophers, yes. And so that's why we need to support the humanities and our local philosophy departments. Yes.
Do you have a question? Yeah, I guess it's kind of a follow-up question from your answer. I know that in the text it says that by making the ascent out of the
I'm sorry, I missed that part of your sentence.
Yeah, I know that in the text, by making that ascent out of the cave and towards the actual world and looking at the sun, the person's able to see the good and it's being an entirety. And I was just wondering if justice is included in that good, and if the journey was to kind of find what justice means, why they would use the word good instead of justice.
I think because the sun represents the form of the good, and the form of the good is the highest one, because that we can only understand how to bring about a just society when we figure out what sort of things are genuinely good and what sort of things are not, and have our desires aiming at those things. So that's why the good is most important, because we can't understand what a society would be that was genuinely just without having a clear sense of what sorts of things are genuinely worthwhile and what are not.
Yep.
Well, how do you get the idea of how can the American electorate and society broadly practically change how they think about their desires, so they have that understanding and then act on it?
One person at a time. Really, honestly, I don't think it would. I think it would be great if everybody was required to take philosophy and started to think about reflecting on their own beliefs and the source of those, and reflecting on their own desires and where they came from, and whether the satisfaction of them is really satisfying and rewarding. And I think it comes from families and whoever is doing the educating. And I think that's why education is so extraordinarily important in our society, and why we can't underfund it or eliminate those sorts of departments like English and philosophy that ask us to reflect on who we are as human beings and what is genuinely important. If some of us do it and others do not, then I think that we're all going to be trapped in living lives that aren't satisfying to us, because we're going to be forced by other people taking all of the resources that we need even to satisfy our most basic desires.
Do you have questions for each other?
That's an interesting question.
I think there's a question here while you're sitting here. Yep.
So I'm just wondering, this is following on other questions really, but so if the spaces in which we can learn to lead an examined life or be together in motion with other minds are shrinking,
yeah,
and Amherst is becoming a more and more unique, or a unique environment, Amherst and institutions like it. And we're not in the, I don't think of Amherst as in the business of producing professors only, right? So we are sending students out into the world. Do you have a vision of how students at Amherst are being equipped to do the kind of work in whatever environment they're in that you're describing, either helping others to live an examined life or helping, because we can't, it's kind of, what is Amherst's mission in light of that, other than to give a fulfilled life just to the students who are here?
Yeah, that's, there's a question of scale in terms of the value of the face-to-face classroom. I think it's, like I was saying, I think it's it's an unbelievably special place, and you can run a discussion classroom up to maybe 35 students if you're really, really working it, but then it starts to become lecture shortly after that, and then there can be value in that, but it's like it's a different sort of experience than the one that I'm trying to describe. So the kind of commitment to the smaller scale discussion classroom, if it's going to have the kind of like social impact that you're alluding to, is one that almost I feel like it has to have a slightly evangelical bent, and I think probably I do have that. There's something quasi-sermonic about the way that I talk. I think because I think it's these are no times for fooling around. This is if this either matters or it doesn't, and if it does matter, we need to know why. And we need to be able to communicate to our students why it matters. And I think that's the most you can do then, is just to hope that it has some kind of impact like that. You can't do studies of what your students then go on to do, or who they affect, or whatever. There is an element of faith just in teaching and teaching and teaching, and just saying, you now go on with your life. I don't know what effect I've had. I don't know what effect this class has had. And I just hope that something will change, and some kind of if there are pockets all over the place where people are sensing the kind of the split between the mind and the self, and the reduction of the mind to a kind of functional job finding apparatus, and sensing it as a problem. Something can come of that. It's very hard to. You can't scale it up. You can't do this on a massive scale. You can only do it in a bunch of different places, and really have a kind of faith, have a kind of commitment, and know that you're in it for the long term. These buildings are built in stone because they say we're going to be around here for a while, that this project has been around for a while too. There has to be some element of faith in that.
One thing that I would add at the beginning of my talk, it was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but not really. I really do believe that and I said we need philosopher welders, we need philosopher doctors, philosopher lawyers, and my hope is Amherst strives to produce people who are going to be leaders in the society and who are going to have the skills, the leadership skills, and whatever occupations they go in, hopefully they will make decisions and make choices and organize institutions in ways that are compatible with the values that they've come to have. And it's going to be slow. Cultural change is slow, but this is the only way I think it can happen.
So please join me in thanking our speaker.